$38 trillion. That isn't a forecast, and it isn't a scare headline. That is the number sitting on America's balance sheet right now. And here's the uncomfortable truth most people miss. This number doesn't stay in Washington. It leaks into your rent, your grocery bill, your retirement account, and eventually your daily choices. While most people are distracted by markets hitting record highs and headlines celebrating resilience, something far more important is happening quietly. The institutions that actually control capital flows are repositioning. They aren't making speeches, they aren't ringing bells, they're simply shifting exposure away from dollar-centric assets with methodical precision. This isn't speculation. It's visible in filings, reserve data, and long-term allocation changes that only show up if you know where to look. And this isn't unprecedented. In fact, it's eerily familiar. Over the past 5 centuries, the same sequence has unfolded again and again. Different empires, different currencies, same structure, same warning signs, same ending. The mistake people make is assuming collapse looks dramatic at first. It doesn't. It starts quietly, with exits that happen long before panic ever arrives. By the end of this breakdown, you'll understand the pattern, where we are inside it, and why the most dangerous phase is the one nobody talks about. Every major financial power that dominated the world followed a similar arc. First came credibility. Trade flowed through one currency because it was trusted, liquid, and widely accepted. Capital gathered where rules were stable and markets were deep. Prosperity followed naturally. Then success bred confidence. Governments expanded their reach. Military commitments grew. Social obligations multiplied. Borrowing became easier than restraint, especially when demand for the currency remained strong. Debt no longer felt dangerous because asset prices kept rising. Growth masked imbalance. At this stage, warnings were dismissed as pessimism. After all, the system had worked for decades. Why would it stop now? But underneath the surface, the math quietly shifted. Obligations grew faster than productivity. Interest costs crept upward. Stability began to depend on constant intervention. This phase never ends because of ideology or politics. It ends because arithmetic eventually dominates narratives. When debt compounds faster than income, the system requires either continuous expansion or continuous support. And that's where the final transition begins. The most important stage is the one almost no one notices in real time. This is when capital doesn't panic, it plans. Large institutions don't sell everything overnight. They rebalance slowly. Exposure is reduced, risk is redistributed. Diversification becomes geographic, not just sector-based. Public confidence remains high during this phase. Markets still rise. Media narratives stay optimistic. Political leaders reassure voters. But underneath that calm, the people with the best information are quietly preparing for a different future. This is when foreign reserve managers trim positions instead of adding, when pension funds adjust duration risk, when sovereign investors choose alternatives not because they're superior, but because concentration risk has become too large to ignore. Nothing collapses yet, nothing breaks. That's why this phase is so dangerous. It feels normal. But once enough capital leaves, the system loses flexibility. At that point, policy choices narrow rapidly, and reactions become forced instead of strategic. History shows this clearly. Spain dominated global finance in the 16th century, fueled by unprecedented inflows of precious metals. Its currency became the medium of international exchange. Wealth poured in from across continents. But military expansion consumed resources faster than revenue could replace them. Borrowing filled the gap. For a time, gold inflows disguised the imbalance. Then lenders quietly changed behavior. They demanded harder terms. They relocated capital. Defaults followed in waves, not once, but repeatedly. What mattered wasn't a single failure. It was the loss of trust. Once that broke, Spain never recovered its financial leadership. Power moved elsewhere, not because Spain lacked resources, but because confidence had already shifted. The Dutch Republic repeated the pattern a century later. Innovation, financial sophistication, and trade dominance made Amsterdam the center of global capital. The system looked unstoppable. Then leverage crept in. Wars drained resources, asset bubbles formed. Institutions quietly violated their own rules to maintain appearances. Insiders noticed first. Capital moved to safer ground long before the public understood why. When the reckoning came, it wasn't gradual. Confidence vanished quickly once exposed. The currency lost relevance, leadership passed on, dominance ended not with an explosion, but with a quiet migration of trust. Britain followed next. For over 2 centuries, the pound underpinned global trade. London financed the world. The empire's reach seemed permanent. 2 global wars changed the equation. Debt surged, reserves drained. Attempts to preserve the old system delayed adjustment but made the final correction harsher. Capital left before status was officially lost. By the time the pound was devalued, the decision had already been made by markets years earlier. What's striking is how familiar the timeline feels. Financial leadership didn't disappear overnight. It faded as alternatives became more attractive and risks became harder to justify. Now look at the present. After World War II, the dollar inherited the same role. Global trade, reserves, and assets centered around it. For decades, demand absorbed growing deficits without strain. That changed when constraints were removed. Once convertibility ended, spending expanded without natural limits. Debt accelerated. Monetary expansion became a tool of stability rather than a response to crisis. Asset prices rose faster than incomes. Wealth concentrated. Imbalances grew. At first, it worked. It always does. But the scale eventually matters. When total obligations reach multiples that history has never sustained, behavior changes. Not loudly, quietly. That quiet change is already visible. Major holders of U.S. debt are reducing exposure gradually. Central banks diversify reserves. Institutions recommend broader international allocation. Even domestic entities absorb more issuance to keep auctions stable. This doesn't signal collapse tomorrow. It signals transition underway. The system still functions, but it requires increasing internal support to maintain the same external confidence. That's not strength, it's dependency. Once this phase begins, outcomes narrow. Either growth accelerates beyond obligations, or adjustments are forced through inflation, currency dilution, or financial repression. History suggests the latter is far more common. What happens next isn't dramatic at first. Trade settles in multiple currencies, reserves diversify incrementally, demand weakens at the margins. But margins matter when volumes are large. As external demand softens, excess currency returns home. Inflation pressure rises. Policymakers face trade-offs with no painless option. Tightening stabilizes prices, but destabilizes debt. Easing protects borrowers, but weakens confidence further. This isn't ideology, it's constraint. Systems built on leverage lose flexibility when trust declines. At that point, outcomes are determined by math, not preference. Many assume exceptionalism changes outcomes. History says otherwise. Power, innovation, and military strength have never overridden monetary arithmetic. Every dominant currency believed it was different. Every one eventually learned it wasn't. Money doesn't collapse because people lose faith suddenly. It erodes because incentives shift slowly until reversal becomes inevitable. That's why the most dangerous moment isn't panic, it's complacency. Understanding this pattern doesn't require fear. It requires realism. The system doesn't ask permission. It unfolds according to structure, incentives, and scale. For individuals, the implication isn't to panic, but to adapt. Concentration risk matters more than optimism. Liquidity matters more than prediction. Flexibility matters more than conviction. The people who navigate transition successfully aren't the loudest or the wealthiest. They're the ones who recognize patterns early and adjust quietly before urgency replaces choice. This isn't about abandoning systems. It's about not being dependent on a single outcome. History doesn't punish ignorance immediately. It punishes it eventually. This isn't fear, it's pattern recognition. 500 years of economic history repeating the same structure with different names and currencies. The signs aren't hidden. They're just ignored until they become unavoidable. You don't need to predict exact dates. You don't need to believe in collapse narratives. You only need to understand where we are in the cycle and why certain behaviors are accelerating right now. If this reframed how you see debt, currency, and capital flows, stay with the channel. In the next breakdown, we'll examine what historically preserved purchasing power during late-stage transitions, what quietly failed despite appearances, and why timing matters less than positioning. Leave a comment with your perspective. I read them all. And if you want to understand the system before it forces adaptation on everyone, subscribe and turn on notifications. History doesn't repeat because people forget facts. It repeats because people ignore patterns.